Our Court of Appeal in May 2014 upheld the constitutionality of this legislative measure. Consequently, as the provisions of Part 13 themselves have not been deemed unconstitutional by a court, they remain part of the Constitution of Belize and are deemed lawful. As said before, a similar approach is being taken in respect of the SOEs and all acts done under them since 2018. There was during this appeal, it went to the Court of Appeals and in 2014, and there was, how could I put, there was this general feeling that the government would have lost that appeal back then, but then it was not necessary to proceed because then there was a settlement between the parties, the owners of the shares of Belize Telemedia and the government of Belize. So in efforts to be able to remove that uncertainty, it is important for us to be able to clarify this and make these amendments to the Constitution. Madam Speaker, we're also introducing in this bill at this stage, because you know, pursuant to Section 65(8) of the Constitution, any bill that will affect the constitutional rights of citizens is to have a 90 days interval between its introduction and second and third readings. I have said earlier, the state of affairs caused by the conflicting decisions cannot persist for too long. So this measure needs to be done at the earliest to start the clock running. This bill will be submitted to the Constitutional and Foreign Affairs Committee of the House, and of course will be subject to intense scrutiny, both before the committee and the public square, as it should be. But make no mistake, Madam Speaker, this measure is taken because it must be taken. At the second reading of this bill, the government will lay out in detail its plan to address crime, including the bolstering of social intervention programs. This measure is to be used not as the end to tackle and address crime. We all know that this is not the way to uproot crime. This will, however, serve as an important measure to detect, prevent and control crime throughout the length and breadth of this country, including tackling the narco-trafficking challenges that we're facing in our country. Madam Speaker, I am urging today, Madam Speaker, that the amendment to this bill or to the Constitution is such importance that I'm appealing to the opposition to join us in making these amendments, because it is something that we must do to be able to have some certainty and to be able to ensure that we can protect our people. There is a great, I think more and more people are starting to feel some sense of helplessness and trying to push governments, or in our case, our government, to take even more draconian measures. Everybody looks at what President Bukele did in El Salvador, and in their mind, if we are unable to tackle this small group of people, it's a few hundred of them, they are starting to push and advocate that maybe the government should consider picking up all of these mostly young men and lock them up so that people can live in peace. But this is not who we are. This is not what we believe in. We believe in a democratic state. We believe in the rights of our citizens, even those that are not following the law, that they must always have access to the law. Because once you start going down that slippery road, it will be difficult to turn around. So it's important, and I'm once again appealing to everyone, not only to the opposition, but even to our social partners and to the public, to understand what we are attempting to do is simply to be able to see how we could address this issue and be able to contain the tempers when they're starting with the killings, for them to cool off, and then for us to be able to do more interventions. As I mentioned earlier, is that we fully understand that this is not how you solve crime. It's a temporary measure. To solve crime, we need to look at the root causes, the challenges of our families are having, challenges of their children going to school and having access, the challenges that many young people, when they come out from school, they feel that they don't have a future, that there's not opportunities for them. We have to be able to continue to address that more and more. Fortunately, we've had a lot of success over the past 4 years and months, or 4 years and a half, that presently most of our young people that want to work can work. That is why our unemployment rate is around 3%. So that those young people, and I remember I always mention what the Minister of Home Affairs mentioned to me once. He said, some of these younger kids that are out there, give Lee trouble because they're out there on the street with nothing to do, are not working, and they're better dressed and they're better behaved. But there is a group of young men and women that for one reason or the other do not have the necessary skills to be able to work in these areas. And many of them, and rightly so, they don't want to go to the fields and cut cane, or to go and pick citrus, or to go and be working under the sun hat with cement in the construction industry. They would want something better. But for them to be able to do something better, then we as a government, both sides, the government and the opposition, we need to come together to find how we can do some programs that can reach out to them. And we're doing some of them. That is where the IT vets can continue to play a critical role, which is something the former Minister of Education, the Honorable Member from Freetown, has been working on. And I'm certain that the new Minister of Education will continue to push that we could get these young people and put them in these schools to be able to retrain them, to retool them, so then they too could become productive members of the society. By and large, Belizeans are a loving people. We are warm. And whenever people come to visit Belize, and we have, for instance, in the tourist industry, people that come to visit us, the one thing that they take away with them is that Belizeans are warm, Belizeans are loving, Belizeans are friendly. That is who we are. But we cannot allow a small group of mostly young men to change that view of who we truly are. So again, by putting these amendments, I believe that we'll then better be able to control for a short while until tempers can cool down, but at the same time give us a chance as a government, together, both sides, to be able to continue to be able to work and come up with more of these programs to be able to give these young people a new chance in life. Madam Speaker, these amendments have the recommendations of the Cabinet. Thank you very much.
Honourable members, that bill is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration and report.
Bill for an act to amend the Belize Constitution, Chapter 4 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020, to provide for declarations of special areas of public safety and public order for the purpose of preventing, detecting or controlling crime and the limiting of rights therein for a period of time, to provide for the establishment of a gun and gun court, to validate certain proclamations of state of emergencies and regulations and all acts and things done by the state thereunder, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto.
I recognize the Honourable Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I rise to introduce a bill for an act to amend the Central Bank of Belize Act, Chapter 262 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020, to provide for the Director General of the Financial Services Commission to be a member of the Board of Directors of the Central Bank of Belize, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental to. Madam Speaker, this bill has the recommendation of the Cabinet. As way of explanation, Madam Speaker, please allow me. The primary objective of this bill is to amend Section 11 of the Central Bank of Belize Act to include a Director General of the Financial Services Commission, the FSC, as an ex officio member of the Board of Directors of the Central Bank of Belize. The bill also amends Section 2 of the Act to include a definition of, quote, Director General, end of quote, to ensure legal clarity. The Central Bank was established in 1982 to foster monetary stability and to promote a sound fiscal structure. The Board of Directors plays a critical role in shaping macro-financial policy and overseeing the integrity of our monetary system. The Financial Services Commission, established under the 2023 FSC Act, is the primary regulator for non-bank financial institutions, including the securities sector and other financial service providers. Currently, the Governor of the Central Bank is already a statutory member of the FSC board under the FSC Act. However, there is no reciprocal representation of the FSC on the Central Bank of Belize's board. This bill seeks to correct that asymmetry. As our financial sector continues to evolve, with increasing integration between banks and non-banks, and as capital markets develop, the need for greater regulatory coordination has become undeniable. Cross-representation between our two principal financial regulators will foster real-time communication and institutional agreement, support the identification and mitigation of systematic risk, promote regulatory consistency and policy coherence across sectors, and help guard against regulatory gaps or arbitrage. It also aligns Belize with the international best practices recommended by the IMF, the World Bank, and other global standard-setting bodies for integrated financial sector supervision. Madam Speaker, this amendment is both timely and necessary. It represents a step towards a more robust, coordinated, and forward-looking financial sector governance in Belize. Madam Speaker, I recommend this bill to the Honorable House. Thank you.
Honorable members, that bill is referred to the Finance and Economic Development Committee for examination, consideration, and report.
Bill for an act to amend the Central Bank of Belize, Chapter 262 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020.
I recognize the Honorable Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I seek the indulgence of this Honorable House to defer the first reading of the Broadcasting Bill 2025 to a later date.
Honorable members, the question is that the first reading of the Broadcasting Bill 2025 be deferred to a later date. All those in favor, kindly say aye. Aye. Those against, kindly say no. I think the ayes have it. I recognize the Honorable Prime Minister. We're not there yet. Recognize the Honorable Prime Minister. Apologies, there was an error on the notes. It is the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to introduce the first reading of the Bill 2025, a bill for an act to repeal and replace the Bail Reform Act, Chapter 100 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020, to reform the bail framework in the criminal justice system and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. This bill has the support of the Cabinet. With your permission, Madam Speaker, I would like to very briefly say a few words on the introduction of the bill. As the long title identifies, this legislative measure seeks to reform the bail framework in the criminal justice system by inter alia repealing and replacing the Bail Reform Act, incorporating the other provisions relating to bail found in a number of other legislations, as well as incorporating new provisions under one new comprehensive law. As the name of the Bail Reform Act signifies, that was a legislative measure which sought to reform the bail framework in Belize. This, however, was enacted in April of 1999, 25 years ago. So since then, applicable principles relating to the grant, denial, variation, or revocation of bail, as well as the principles relating to appeal or review of the decision to grant, deny, vary, or revoke bail, have progressed tremendously over these past 25 years. Since that time, Madam Speaker, piecemeal amendments to various legislation which govern bail in Belize, including the Crime Control and Criminal Justice Act, have been undertaken by successive governments. Other provisions relating to bail are found in other legislation, such as the Police Act, which deals with station bail, the Indictable Procedure Act, which deals with the general power of the High Court to hear and determine bail applications, as well as bail provisions during and after committal of a case to the High Court. The Inferior Courts Act, dealing with the High Court's power to grant bail while it is reviewing a case submitted to it for review from the lower court. And the more recent Senior Courts Act, which deals with bail pending the hearing of a criminal appeal from the lower court to the High Court, as well as bail pending the hearing of a criminal appeal from the High Court to the Court of Appeal. So, Madam Speaker, this can be confusing to even the most skilled judicial officer or practitioner. Needless to say, users of the justice system and unrepresented defendant, critically, have an additional and unnecessary obstacle of having to navigate through this maze. With this Bail Bill 2025, all these provisions, Madam Speaker, are incorporated under one stand-alone law, and the bill seeks to usher in new provisions that are lacking in the current bail regime. These include the following: a new term of art, deciding official, being introduced in the criminal justice system lexicon in Belize to take account of the fact that officials deciding bail are not only the traditional magistrate or judge, but also include a police officer in charge of a station or a justice of the peace. It also makes expressly clear to the deciding official that the starting point in a bail application is that the defendant has an entitlement to bail if the offense is a bailable one. That's clause 4. And significantly, Madam Speaker, a comprehensive provision listing the factors a deciding official is to consider in determining the question of granting, refusing, varying, revoking bail. That is clause 6. So key features of the bill, Madam Speaker, are the requirement that a deciding official must give reasons for granting, refusing, varying, revoking bail. Those are found at clause 9, 2, and 3. Periodic review by a magistrate or judge of all cases in which bail was granted, but the defendant was unable to post bail. That's found at clause 10. And factors to determine who can be a surety and circumstances when a surety amount can be reduced. That's found at clause 5. So, Madam Speaker, the new features of this bill cohere with the government's overarching plan on criminal justice reform. The bail bill will lead to an improvement in access to justice, as persons will be able to readily discern what the law is and have the requisite guidance on how the law works. It will also enable lawyers and judicial officers to be clear on how bail applications are to be conducted. Madam Speaker, I commend this bill to all members of the National Assembly for their support. Thank you.
Honourable members, that bill is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration and report.
Bill for an act to repeal and replace the Bail Reform Act, Chapter 100 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Madam Speaker, I rise to introduce the first reading of the Law Revision and Law Reform Bill 2025, a bill to repeal and replace the Law Revision Act, Chapter 3 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020, to modernize the system of revising and consolidating the laws of Belize, and to make provision for the review and reform of the laws by a Law Reform Commission, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Madam Speaker, this bill has the support of the Cabinet. With your permission, Madam Speaker, I will say a few brief words on the bill. This bill was introduced in the last session of the National Assembly, which ended with the dissolution of the House on February 11, 2025. I will therefore not go into a detailed presentation on this first reading. Just to briefly say, Madam Speaker, that this bill seeks to repeal and replace the current Law Revision Act, which was enacted in 1979, to provide for the revision, publication, and maintenance of an up-to-date set of laws that reflect the legal framework in force at any given time. Experience has shown, Madam Speaker, that the consolidating and updating of our current body of laws needs a further mechanism. That is, in addition to consolidating the laws, the body of laws must also be updated. This is achieved through a reform process. So a Law Reform Commission is an essential tool for facilitating the dynamic evolution of a country's legal framework. In the context of Belize, the creation of a Law Reform Commission would provide several advantages. It would enable Belize to regularly review and reform laws in response to changes in society, the economy, technology, and of course international obligations. So this proactive approach would ensure that Belize's legal system remains relevant, efficient, and responsive to the needs of the country's citizens. Madam Speaker, while the Law Revision Act has provided a foundation for the compilation and consolidation of Belize's laws, the need for a more robust and continuous approach to law reform is essential for the legal system to remain responsive to modern challenges. The establishment of a Law Reform Commission would address this need by providing a specialized, systematic, and consultative mechanism for law reform. Accordingly, Madam Speaker, this government, in fulfillment of its Plan Belize manifesto, is today introducing this bill to put in place the necessary apparatus and to ensure the modernizing of the system of revision and consolidation of the laws of Belize. I thank you.
Honourable members, that bill is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration and report.
Bill for an act to repeal and replace the Law Revision Act, Chapter 3 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to introduce the Civil Registry and Vital Statistics Bill 2025, which is a bill for an act to repeal and replace the Registration of Births and Deaths Act, Chapter 157 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020, to provide for the digitalization of the Registry of Births, Deaths, and other life events, to provide for the organizational restructuring of the Vital Statistics Unit, to convert the office into a department, to support the new business operations and functions, to provide for the registration and filing of life events, to provide for harsher penalties for offences, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. This bill has the support of the Cabinet. Madam Speaker, again, with your permission, I'll briefly say a few words. Madam Speaker, as we all know, a well-functioning civil registry system is necessary and essential to ensure an individual's right to a legal identity, provides a foundation for an identity management system that facilitates citizens' access to critical public services, including health care, education, and employment. The Vital Statistics Unit, established under the Registration of Births and Deaths Act, is the agency primarily responsible for upkeep and safeguarding the country's register of all life events occurring in Belize, including births, deaths, marriages, and adoptions. In doing so, VSU engages key stakeholders, such as the Ministry of Health and Wellness, marriage officers, court officers, the SIB, Statistical Institute of Belize, and indeed all citizens of Belize, here at home and abroad. The VSU offers its services in 8 different areas, spanning all districts in Belize. In 2022, the Attorney General's Ministry and the then Ministry of Public Utilities, Energy, Logistics, and E-Governance officially launched the Strengthening Civil Registry Project with the core objective to modernize and improve service delivery at the Vital Statistics Unit. The transformation of the Vital Statistics Unit is fundamental to the commitment of the Plan Belize Medium-Term Development Strategy, which speaks to increasing government efficiency and performance by providing services at minimum cost, minimum time, and minimum bureaucracy for citizens. This transformation has also been identified as a national priority, as it is key to executing the vision of the National Digital Agenda, to build trust in government services by providing reliable, inclusive, safe, and efficient digital solutions for all. So, Madam Speaker, coming out of the strengthening of the Civil Registry Project, a number of challenges were identified, leading to the overall conclusion of the need for 1, organizational restructuring of the VSU, and 2, the reform of the legal framework of the VSU to account for the organizational restructuring and the implementation of an electronic database system to usher in a new online service delivery model. So this, Madam Speaker, in short, is the purpose of this bill: the repeal and replacement of the Registration of Births and Deaths Act to account for the much-needed organizational restructuring of the VSU and the digitalization of the Registry of Births, Deaths, and other life events, and the implementation of a new electronic registry. This is a critically important bill, Madam Speaker, and I encourage all members of this National Assembly to support this bill. I thank you.
Honorable members, that bill is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report.
Bill for an act to repeal and replace the Registration of Births and Deaths Act, Chapter 157 of the Substantive Laws of Belize, Revised Edition 2020.
I recognize the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this is the National Assembly Powers, Privileges, and Immunities Bill 2025. I rise to introduce an act to repeal and replace the Legislative Assembly Powers and Privileges Act to declare and define certain powers, privileges, and immunities of the National Assembly and of the members and officers of such assembly, to secure freedom of speech in the National Assembly, to regulate admittance to the precincts of the National Assembly, to give protection to the persons employed in the publication of the reports and other members of the National Assembly, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Madam Speaker, this bill has the recommendation of the Cabinet. And again, with your permission, I will very briefly say a few words by way of introduction. Madam Speaker, this bill too, as you know, was introduced in the last session of the National Assembly, which ended on February 11, 2025. As was previously done, I would like to place on record that this bill being presented today is in large measure as a result of the industry and advocacy of yourself, Madam Speaker, and the President of the Senate, who as presiding officers are acutely aware of the need for the laws which regulate us as members of the National Assembly to be updated and to become workable. So we certainly want to place on record our gratitude for your leadership on this very important piece of legislation, Madam Speaker. The current law which governs the powers, privileges, and privileges, and immunities of the National Assembly is an old law, the Legislative Assembly Ordinance 1962. This law predates the establishment of the National Assembly in December 1963 and the independence of Belize and the Belize Constitution in 1981. This bicameral system, established since 1963, provides for a House of Representatives to be presided over by a Speaker and a Senate to be presided over by a Senate. The extant law, however, refers to a unicameral legislative assembly and refers to terms and offices of a colonial Belize. And while the ordinance, Madam Speaker, defines the powers, privileges, and immunities of the Legislative Assembly and of members of the Legislative Assembly, at the same time this ordinance was enacted, only the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly existed, and there was no Senate. Further, Madam Speaker, while it is true that the courts have expressed that the ordinance still has the force of law in Belize, there are, however, gaps and ambiguities in the existing law which govern members of the National Assembly. These, Madam Speaker, all members will agree, must be addressed, particularly since no change has been made to the ordinance since its enactment. So, Madam Speaker, this is the purpose of this bill, to address those ambiguities that currently exist in the ordinance, to modernize, update the ordinance, to make it workable, as I said earlier, to ensure it refers specifically to the National Assembly of Belize, to ensure, very importantly, that it is in line with the Constitution of Belize, and of course that it reflects a legislative bicameral system of an independent Belize. So, Madam Speaker, I urge all members to support this bill. And in closing, Madam Speaker, I just want to place on record, on behalf of our side, on behalf of the government, our deep gratitude, because all these bills that I've presented today, introduced today, have been presented on behalf of our Attorney General, the Honorable Anthony Sylvester Jr. So we want to place on record our deep gratitude to him and his entire team at the Attorney General's Ministry. They are, relentless in the work that they're doing, tremendous work, a deep commitment to reforming and updating the laws of Belize. And in particular, they're focusing on criminal justice reform, which affects the lives of everyday citizens. So we want to place on record our gratitude, or appreciation, or admiration, and acknowledgement of the leader of that team, Attorney General Anthony Sylvester Jr., but the Solicitor General as well, the entire team of Crown Counsels who work tirelessly to support and develop the legislation that underpins the work of this government. So thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honorable members, that bill is referred to the Constitution and Foreign Affairs Committee for examination, consideration, and report.
Bill for an act to repeal and replace the Legislative Assembly Powers and Privileges Act. Motions relating to the business or sittings of the House.
I recognize the Honorable Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I move that at its rising today, the House suspends to June 27th, May 2025 at 9 a.m. What, Tuesday, 27th May? Did I say
Correct.
that? Okay.
Correct.
2025 at 9 a.m.
Honorable members, the question is that the House at its rising today suspends to Tuesday, 27 May 2025 at 9 a.m. All those in favor kindly say aye. Those against kindly say no. I think the ayes have it.
Public business, government business.
Honorable members, before we dispatch, which will be on the dispense, with the debate for the second reading of the General Revenue Appropriation, I will call on the Prime Minister so that we can dispense with Standing Order 12, given the time that we're at. And shortly thereafter, I'll ask just for a quick recess so that we can accommodate the podium for the Leader of the Opposition, as has been tradition. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, in accordance with Standing Orders 12.8, I move that the proceedings on the order paper may be entered upon and proceeded with at this day's sitting at any hour due opposed.
Honorable members, the question is that the proceedings on the order paper may be entered upon and proceeded with at this day's sitting at any hour due opposed. All those in favor kindly say aye. Those against kindly say no. I think the ayes have it. We will break for a very short recess so that the staff can accommodate the podium. Thank you. Honorable members, the debate on the second reading of the General Revenue Appropriation 2025-2026 Bill 2025 is about to be resumed. Before we begin, I would like to remind honorable members about Standing Order number 64, presentation and the second reading of the appropriation bill, especially paragraph 5, which reads, after the motion for the second reading of the appropriation bill has been resumed under paragraph 4 of the standing order, the debate shall be confined to the financial and economic state of the country and the general principles of government policy and administration as indicated by the appropriation bill and the estimates. Members are therefore asked to confine their debate within the prescribed limits of the aforementioned standing order. I would like to remind honorable members of the other parts of the standing orders, specifically standing order number 42B. We haven't heard that for some time, which states that an honorable member shall maintain silence while another member is speaking and shall not interrupt except in accordance with these standing orders. We now have the resumption of the debate on the General Revenue Appropriation 2025-2026 Bill 2025. I recognize the Honorable Leader of the Opposition. Member for Albert.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. We're living in interesting times, under interesting circumstances. Let me first, Madam Speaker, acknowledge my colleagues on both sides of this honorable House, the People's House, as we work together to build a strong governance framework for Belize via a robust and functioning legislature. You see, Madam Speaker, to preserve, to promote, and to defend our democracy, we need both the government and the opposition to work hand in hand. As members of the opposition, we have a constitutional responsibility to hold the executive and ourselves to account. Unlike this administration, we do not promote the ideology that you did it, so we are justified in doing it too. We are here to judiciously examine the legislative framework and policies that are proposed by this sitting administration that will ultimately affect either positively or negatively the lives and livelihoods of the citizens of our beloved Belize. May I preface my contributions, Madam Speaker, but that making it clear that outside of the popular view, we on this side do not oppose solely for opposition or for some frivolous political advantage. That is not who we are. We are not here to embarrass the government, who has been given a clear mandate to govern. We are here in this National Assembly as partners in this great work of nation building, to thoroughly scrutinize, offer feedback, and share our insights into the government's priorities as outlined in the appropriation bill 2025-2026, and to ensure that there are legitimate and transparent processes for the voices of the people to be heard on all matters of national importance and national concern. Madam Speaker, as our oath of office requires, we are each given a sacred duty and a profound responsibility to conscientiously, impartially, and to the best of our abilities to discharge our duties as members of this House of Representatives and to do right by all manner of people without fear or favor, affection or ill will. As the first woman to serve in the role of the leader of the opposition, and as I deliver this maiden address, I am determined to raise the tone and the substance of this debate. Some may counter that this is not an easy thing to do, but I am of the firm view that the people of Belize deserve more than political reflexes and rhetorical posturing. They deserve a debate that reflects the seriousness of their struggles and carefully outline the clarity of their expectations. It is in this spirit, Madam Speaker, that I rise to make my rebuttal to this year's budget debate. Please allow me as well, Madam Speaker, to give a big shout out to the special people of the Albert constituency, to the members of our Albert Action Committee and the Albert Care Team, on whose behalf I have the distinct privilege of sitting in this seat. I take this opportunity to thank them for their vote of confidence in my leadership and for their unwavering support. They knew that we were up against a lot in the most recent elections. The government of the day came at us with guns drawn and blazing. But, Madam Speaker, I'm happy to report that the people of Albert remain steady. Neither their voices, nor their votes, or their loyalty were on sale. And I owe them all a deep debt of gratitude. With your concurrence, Madam Speaker, I seek your permission to refer to my prepared remarks. Madam Speaker, it is important that we bring into sharp focus the Prime Minister's budget speech and highlight the difference between truth and well-scripted talking points. I believe, Madam Speaker, that it was the prolific writer Mark Twain who remarked, and I quote, "Facts are stubborn, but statistics are more pliable," end of quote. This sentiment perfectly describes the 2025-2026 budget speech delivered by the member of Orange Walk Central 2 weeks ago. Madam Speaker, we all sat and listened to almost 2 hours of rehearsed optimism, padded with selective statistics and proposals that are painfully detached from the lived experiences of ordinary Belizeans. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's budget entitled From Promise to Performance, carefully polished in delivery, did not take into consideration the pressing needs of the masses, or in particular, the most vulnerable and marginalized within our society. May we point out, Madam Speaker, that there is a widening gap between those who have and those who are desperately trying to make ends meet. Even the gainfully employed, Madam Speaker, must engage in what is commonly known to us as a side hustle. That is, a part-time job or occupation undertaken in addition to one's regular employment to offset the escalating cost of living. The main issue is clear. The budget is insubstantial and lacks vision, offering more spin than solutions. Perhaps a more honest and appropriate theme would have been from performance poetry to policy pain. We sit on this side of the aisle will break down the rhetoric and seek to get us all, in their nomenclature, back on track. Back to calling it as it is and not what they pretended to be. Madam Speaker, I first begin with the social protection programs and the need, Madam Speaker, for social protection to be a national priority. Madam Speaker, there's a human cost to the government's economic priorities. While our government officials congratulate themselves on spreadsheets and surpluses, thousands of families are struggling with inflationary pressures. While ministers applaud fiscal discipline, rural communities still lack access to basic health services, safer roads, quality education, and meaningful employment, particularly for the unemployed youth. While the government boasts about GDP growth, farmers, teachers, public servants, security officers, and the working poor are still waiting with bated breath for improved living conditions, salary relief, lower food prices, reduced fuel costs, and access to social protection programs. Perhaps, Madam Speaker, this is the best place to start. Successive governments have always under-budgeted for social protection programs, despite the lip service given to addressing poverty or inequality. The budget, Madam Speaker, is a far cry from a socially focused, economically grounded, and politically strategic at a time when it may be needed the most. In the context of this budget, the government has prioritized a single high visibility intervention, the NHI rollout for the Cayo district, which I will address in more detail later, while neglecting other key components: boosts, grocery bag assistance, housing for the underprivileged, skill training for the unemployed, health care for the elderly and the abused, and labor protections for those who are victimized. All are necessary for a comprehensive and resilient social protection system. Madam Speaker, it is on this platform that the People's United Party was first elected to govern in 2020 and again in 2025. The rallying cry, the promise of Plan Belize and Plan Belize 2.0 is that everybody fi win. Todos ganamos. We the stay pan track. Let us be fair. While the rollout of our community-based healthcare made accessible to all Belizeans is indeed welcome, one program does not a system make. Madam Speaker, in economies like ours, where vulnerability is widespread and fiscal space is narrow, social protection becomes not just a shield, but a catalyst. Programs like school feeding with a nationwide reach, maternal grants, and pension assistance don't just relieve hardships, they're multipliers. They raise school attendance, they reduce child labor, they empower women, and most importantly, contribute to building a more resilient society. Madam Speaker, in Belize, successive governments have received technical assistance from development partners, UNICEF, the ILO, and the World Bank, each urging us toward a social protection floor, not a ceiling, a floor. That is a nationally defined set of minimum social guarantees designed to prevent or alleviate poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. A social protection floor, as it is defined, seeks to provide a basic level of protection for citizens, not as a charity, but rather as sound fiscal policy for national development. The role of government, then, Madam Speaker, is to provide a system that works when markets fail, when families are marginalized, when countries have to bear the ramifications of unforeseen pandemics or when climate shocks displaces the productive sector. The moral core of taxation itself is that we each contribute within our means, not only for physical infrastructure, for roads and buildings, but also for social infrastructure, so that our shared institutions can fill gaps that no individual or company can fill on their own, especially in times when we are exposed to serious risk and vulnerabilities. If we are serious about our obligations to future generations, we must be equally serious about the safety nets and ladders that allow every Belizean to live with dignity, with security, and with a sense of purpose. Madam Speaker, the most recent report that inflation has dropped to 1.4% as of March of this year brings this concept into sharp focus. Ask any Belizean consumer in a grocery store, and they will laugh or perhaps cry. Food prices remain unbearably high, spiraling out of control. So high, in fact, that store owners have now started to post photos of people stealing food, a desperate indicator of how just disconnected this budget is from daily survival. When parents risk being charged, or even worse, risk being sent to jail just to feed their children, something is very, very wrong. It won't be fixed, and it cannot be fixed by massaging the inflation numbers. Once upon a time, Madam Speaker, not too long ago, Belizeans in need of food could count on organizations like the Belize Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and Samuel Haynes Institute for Food Assistance. Today, these avenues have been discontinued. Assistance now hinges on the goodwill of political operatives who show up at best irregularly. Food insecurity for the most vulnerable has now become a normalized crisis. Madam Speaker, I hope to make the case on behalf of all Belizeans that the numbers presented by this Briceño administration does not, and let me say that again, does not signal performance. Rather, it reveals a government that is obsessed with spending and allergic to accountability, reform, and measuring the economic impact of their failing social protection policies. Social protection, Madam Speaker, is the promise that no Belizean child, parent, elderly, or unemployed should fall through the cracks of economic progress. It should not be viewed as a handout, Madam Speaker, but rather a hand up It is the scaffolding that allows families to climb from subsistence to sufficiency, from survival to security. And it is precisely the kind of public good that a government acting collectively on behalf of its people is best positioned to provide. Fiscal year 2025-2026 budget overview. Madam Speaker, before us today is not just a fiscal document. This is a statement of national priorities. Governments should serve as a bridge between what citizens can do for themselves and what must be done collectively in the interests of justice, equity, nation building. Madam Speaker, we on this side of the House urge our colleagues, we strongly urge our colleagues on the other side not to reduce governance to a ledger. This country is not a balance sheet, and the budget must reflect a balance between fiscal prudence and human dignity. We now turn our attention to the budget's revenue and expenditure estimates. This is where the rhetoric meets the numbers. This is where promises meet allocations. This is where we test where the values we proclaimed, the values we hold on to, are matched by the dollars we commit. Madam Speaker, the budget for this year is broken down as follows: $1.7 billion in projected revenues and grants, $1.52 billion in tax revenue, $135 million in non-tax revenue, $11.6 million in capital revenue, and $71.8 million in grants. It is also estimated that we will spend $1.78 billion in expenditures, $1.25 billion in recurrent expenditure, $336.4 million in Capital 2 expenditure, $184.9 million in Capital 3 expenditure. Madam Speaker, the 2025-2026 budget is framed as the largest capital budget in Belize's history. While we're spending hundreds of millions on concrete and cement, we're falling short on the fundamental and foundational protections that safeguard families when the economy falters or when misfortune strikes. There is also a deafening silence on how public works programs can be used as a tool to engage the unemployed. Many of the infrastructure projects listed are rollovers from the UDP administration that for some reason are languishing. Monies were sought and borrowed to provide the enabling environment for Belizean goods and services to flourish. In this fiscal period, Madam Speaker, revenues are projected to rise by $94 million, but half of this depends on uncertain grants. Meanwhile, expenditures increases by $118 million, relying heavily on external goodwill. On the expenditure side, personal emoluments of $584 million and pensions of $113.7 million consume over 56% of recurrent expenditure. However, the genuine needs of teachers, public servants, healthcare providers, and public officers have not been considered in these estimates. For some time now, Madam Speaker, public officers or the unions have been voicing their concerns. They demand promise raises and increments, pension support, and improved working conditions. These cries have fallen on deaf ears, only to be addressed when the weight of the unions come down to bear on the shoulders of those who are elected to lead and elected to serve. I take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank our sisters and brothers who lead the charge in our unions. Sister Nadia Martin Callis from the BNTU, Sister Ella Waite of the NTUCB, Brother Dean Flowers of the PSU, Sister Leonora Flowers of the Christian Workers Union, Brother Jose Escalera of the Belize Energy Workers Union, and all those who have picked up the mantle and sounded the call when injustices become just too blatant to ignore. We can all agree that the escalating costs of living and high inflationary rates, households now have less purchasing power. From my own personal experience, a minimum of 20% less of basic food supplies can be bought with $100. When you were able to buy $100 at the store, what you now get in terms of goods and services is just at about 80 in terms of value. Even the increase in minimum wage, Madam Speaker, from $3.30 to $5 per hour, and a promise of yet another increase for an additional $1 to $6, are not able to significantly alleviate the concerns of those who are working harder and not able to consume. You wish to contribute to my debate, member for Pixar? Can we have some respect, please, Madam Speaker?
gave his presentation, there was silence, please. And it is a standing order, 42B. Member for Albert, your proposition.
Madam Speaker, income generating households should not have to make decisions about putting food on the table and paying their utility bills. Juggling priorities have become a great big balancing act that the working class faces monthly. Let me state the obvious. Minimum wage is not financed by the state. It is a mandate for our partners in the private sector. And while it is right to recognize progress, it is equally right to ask, why has the government while it is right to recognize progress, it is equally right to ask, why has the government not contributed financially to improving household resilience? Madam Speaker, for the avoidance of any doubt, those of us on this side of the House support the call of our teachers for overdue salary increments and an 8.5% increase in salary. This administration, Madam Speaker, can find the resources for all sorts of programs and initiatives. So let us find the money to pay our teachers and public officers who are first on call to make sacrifices whenever the need arises. There should be concerted efforts to improve the efficiency of government services, to enhance oversight of the public resources usage, to rebuild a severely broken financial system, and to mitigate against the misappropriation of public funds. Corruption is rampant. Madam Speaker, the misuse of public funds must stop. Doing so will allow this administration to address the pressing concerns within the public sector. This past Friday, Madam Speaker, one of our local evening news broadcast stations aired a story about 2 security contracts that were given post haste to POP cronies for a total sum of $28.5 million for a period of 10 years via a select tendering process. That means by special invitation at the discretion of the responsible government entity. This is not to say that the government does not have an oversight obligation to keep our citizens and visitors alike safe while traveling in our domestic airspace. But one must question how these contracts were awarded. The point is, when the administration wants to find money, it finds money, come hell or high water. Belizean citizens should also be asking, why is it that this administration is now procuring and paying for security services for commercial providers? This is, Madam Speaker, a knee-jerk reactionary decision to ward off the attacks on the civil aviation regulatory bodies who seem impotent in addressing such an egregious national security breach. In 2021, Madam Speaker, when the PUP first came to office, after having to sit it out for 3 consecutive terms, they did so on a firm commitment to establish the national gold standard for transparency and accountability. We don't forget the good governance motion, Madam Speaker, that was passed in the chambers of this very National Assembly with much fanfare. It outlined the strengthening of democratic institutions, faithfully upholding and defending